What is the best shader node in Blender? I believe it hands down has to be the Principled BSDF. Let's talk about why. To get started, let's set up our scene. So first of all, I'm going to press Shift A in my 3D viewport, and then under Mesh, I'm just going to choose UV Sphere. You'll see that our sphere is quite jagged, so I can just right click it and then choose Shade Smooth. Then I'm going to come down to my timeline here, I'm going to left click the clock, and I'm going to change the shader editor. This will allow us to add materials. I'm also going to make sure that this option here is set to object and not line style or world, as these edit different things. I'll left click my object to select it, and I'm going to press this plus new button to add a new material. You can also add a new material by coming down to this properties panel in the bottom right hand corner, and then coming to the material properties option, and here you can see you can add a material here too. And you'll notice that when I edit any of these parameters here, it's going to affect it in this menu as well, as these are pretty much two ways of representing the exact same information. However, right now, if I left click my base color, which as you might imagine changes the color of our material, and set it to something like red, we won't see a difference because we need to go into material preview. So I'm just going to come up to the top here and turn on our viewport shading. However, some users in Blender 4.2 will encounter this issue where their material will be completely black even though we've changed the color of it. To fix this is very simple. All we need to do is come up to our render properties by left clicking the back of the camera icon. Then where it says render engine, I'm going to change from cycles to Eevee temporarily. The reason I need to go into the Eevee settings, which if you don't know is Blender's real-time engine, is because this material preview mode actually uses a version of Eevee. So whether or not you're using cycles in your final render, if you want to be able to see things in this material preview viewport shading, you will need to change some settings in Eevee for Blender 4.2. I'm going to open up this ray tracing tab, left click this box to turn on ray tracing, and then I'm going to change my max roughness to 1. And now we can see things are working properly. If this hasn't worked for you, this might be that your computer is incompatible with the new Eevee changes in Blender 4.2. In which case, I would recommend downgrading to Blender 4.1, which is still a really good version of Blender. For everyone else though, we'll just continue on with the tutorial. So I'm going to left click and drag this here just to pull up my shader editor a little bit. As we covered, this first parameter here is called the base color, and it just allows us to change the color of our material. You'll notice that it has this yellow socket, and that indicates that this is a color socket. As you might guess then, all of these grey sockets are for black and white color information. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this later, but I thought I'd just prime you with that information to get the cogs turning in your head. What these little circles can do though is they allow you to plug information in order to affect our shader's appearance. So I'm going to press Shift A, and then under texture, I'm going to choose one of Blender's procedural built-in textures. One I like to use is called the noise texture, and pretty much all this thing does is create a bunch of randomly generated noise. If I left click and drag this grey socket FAC into the surface, you can see that it's generating a bunch of black and white random noise values. And if I plug my color socket into the surface, you can see it's doing the same thing, but instead is using color information. This isn't really too relevant to the Principled BSDF, but I thought I'd quickly mention it just to build a little bit of familiarity with other features in the software. I'm going to plug this color into the base color of my Principled BSDF, and right now you'll see that our object has gone invisible. This is because our BSDF has been unplugged from our surface, and this material output node is really important for determining what our object will look like, and it's important that we make sure that this green socket is plugged into the surface. Now we can see that our noise texture's color is being shown on our object, but you'll notice it is different from when we just plug the color straight into the surface. It almost has a shaded effect to it, hence why these nodes here with the green banner on top are called shaders. Because essentially what they're doing is they're taking this information being put into the shader. In this example, it's our noise texture's color, and then it's applying lighting calculations to it in order to give it a shaded effect. For example, in the real world, if you had a red ball, the ball is red, but the ball is going to be darker in some areas because of light creating shadow and showing some form. Of course, I can plug black and white information into my color as well, so I could plug my factor into this base color, and now I've got a black and white noisy ball. I'm going to unplug this just now, but we're going to be using the noise texture later to explain some of the other parameters. Next up, we have metallic. I like to think of this as an on and off switch, so I either keep it at 0 or 1. When it's at 0, this object is a non-metal material, but if I set it to 1, our material becomes metallic, as you can see just now. What you want to avoid though is turning this to something like 0.5, as now our material is in between being a diffuse or non-metal material and a metal material, which doesn't really make any realistic sense. However, that's not to say you can't do this for artistic reasons, it's just not very realistic. For that reason, I always keep this metallic value at either 0 or 1. For now, I'm going to change it back to 0 so we can explain the next parameter, but we'll be touching on metallic a little bit more after. I'll set this to 0. Next up, we've got roughness. Roughness is essentially a parameter which allows you to control the clarity of reflections. Right now it's in the middle, so it's not a super reflective material, but it's not a super rough material either. So if I set this to 0, you can see that we can see a lot of reflections of trees. The reason for that is because our material preview mode here is actually using something called an HDRI, which is like an image of, in this case, a bunch of trees and some grass being used to light up our scene. So that's why you can actually see things in material preview, even though we don't have any light objects in our scene. And actually, any light objects you add won't affect our material preview mode. They will only affect our render preview. Our roughness is set to 0, which means that it's got the maximum amount of reflectiveness. But if we were to set it to 1, it would now be completely rough and we can see no reflections at all. Why is it called roughness though and not reflection clarity? Well, this is because in real life, objects that are really rough surfaced, for example a brick, are going to give very little reflections because of their rough surface. This is because there's loads of bumps, which means when the light hits it, it's not going to be reflected back as clearly. Whereas when a surface is really smooth, which is the opposite of a rough surface, it means the reflections will be reflected back really clearly. That's not to say that rough surfaces don't have reflection. All materials have reflection. It's just that when a surface is smoother, those reflections appear clearer to us, and we can form an image out of them. Something you'll notice though is that this is more like an absolute roughness. So if I set this to 0, the entire material will become completely reflective. Some beginner artists might think that this is fairly normal, but if you'd give it a little bit more thought, even the most smoothest of surfaces will have slight differences in reflection due to fingerprints and things like that, which might make the material slightly more rough in certain areas. And that's where these little grey sockets come in. Like I mentioned with base color, we can plug a socket into here to control the color of our object. And we can use these textures with these grayscale parameters as well, although some of them don't really make sense to use. To see what we're working with, I'm going to plug my factor back into the surface. And to better demonstrate my next point, I'm going to be adding an extra node called a color ramp. So I'm going to press Shift A, then under converter, I'm going to choose color ramp, and I'm going to plug it in between the noise texture and the surface. The color ramp allows us to adjust the contrast of our color input, as well as changing the colors themselves. For us though, we want to keep it black and white since we're going to be plugging it into a black and white socket, which is indicated by this grey circle here. To adjust the contrast, we can simply left click and drag these notches, and you'll notice that as I move it, the black becomes stronger here. And if I then move the white one closer to the black one, it'll become stronger too. If you want to make it completely black and white with no grayscale values in between, you can change it from linear here to constant. And you'll notice that we now only have black and white. This will make it easy for our explanation. I'm now going to plug the color of my color ramp into the roughness. And I want you to notice how this affects the reflections. I'll then plug my BSDF into the surface. Straight away, you can see that we have some splotches in our reflections. There's areas which have no reflection at all, and areas which have perfect reflection. To see this a little bit clearer, I'm actually going to turn my metallic value back to 1. You'll notice that now I've turned it into a metallic material, we can see this contrast much clearer. This is because when a metal is completely rough, it almost looks like a non-metal. Whereas when metals are really smooth, they are super reflective, even more than non-metals. As you can see, there's a pretty stark contrast in the clarity of reflections here. But how do we know which one is which? Well, if I plug the color of my color ramp into the surface, you'll notice that the areas that were really reflective were this black material, whereas the areas which were really rough were this white material. This is because grayscale values, or black and white values, can be represented with a number. And if you notice, if I unplug this noodle here from my roughness, roughness works from a number between 0 and 1. So which number is which? Well, black represents the number 0, so you can think of it as like the lights are off, so it's 0. And white represents the number 1. I like to think of this as when you switch on the lights, it's like number 1. So 0 for off and 1 for on. If that explanation confuses you, please feel free to discard it and just try and remember it as white represents number 1 and black represents number 0. And grayscale values in between will give you a value between 0 and 1 that corresponds to that grayscale value. It's why if you left click any color channel here and you go into HSV, which stands for hue saturation value, you can actually adjust the value here, and you'll notice that I can change this to something like 0.2, and that will give us a grayscale value for that number. For example, if I was to left click this black notch, and maybe I could change the value to 0.5, and I'll left click my other notch here, the white one, and I'll change this value to 0.5 as well. Now we have a plain grayscale value, which is 0.5, and if I plug the color into the roughness, and then BSDF into the surface, this roughness just now would be the same as setting our roughness to 0.5 like this, but instead we're using color information. I'm going to unplug this for now. I just want to touch on one more thing for metals and non-metals in relation to roughness. These are more things you will notice. First of all, I'm going to change my base color back to white. So to do that, I can just turn my saturation all the way down to 0. You will notice that as a metallic material gets darker, its reflections will become a lot less clear. However, for non-metals, so if I set this metallic value to 0, the opposite is true. when the color is closer to black, the reflections are more clear. In fact, even though this is a non-metal, it kind of looks metallic because of its closeness to the color black. But if I set it to a color like white, you'll notice that the reflections are a lot less clearer than the black or that red color that we were using earlier. So that's a cool thing to remember with metals and non-metals. If you watched my Diffuse BSDF tutorial, you'll remember how I talked briefly about what something called diffusion is. Diffusion is something that only non-metals have. That's why earlier I said that when we turn metallic to 1, we're switching between diffuse and metallic. But what diffusion is in the real world is something non-metals do. When light hits it, it absorbs some of the color information, affecting its overall appearance. Whereas for metals, they won't absorb any color, rather the light that they absorb will only affect its physical temperature to the touch. That's why you find that metals react a lot more to temperature than non-metals. And for that reason, they give us much clearer reflections, as there's no color information being absorbed to make these reflections less clear. I'm going to go ahead and turn my metallic down to 0. I'm going to move on to the next parameter called IOR. IOR stands for Index of Refraction, and it allows us to have a little bit more control over our material. 1.5 is usually fine to leave at the default, but if you wanted to get a slightly more realistic material, you could use the correct IOR for the type of material you're making. For example, plastic, crown glass, and water all have different IOR values, even though they're all non-metal materials. So this can just be a great way to add a little bit of extra realism. I have a free Index of Refraction guide, which you can find in the description below if you're interested. There's also plenty of resources online if you can't find the material you're looking for. You don't need to stress too much on this though, like I say, as this is more just like getting that little extra touch of realism, but it's not by any means the most important thing. Next up, let's talk about alpha. Alpha is set to 1 by default, which means we can completely see our material. What I mean by this is if I set my alpha to 0, you'll see that our object goes completely invisible. So this is pretty much what alpha controls, the transparency of our object. If I go to 0.5, it's kind of going to go halfway, and if I turn it to 1, we'll be able to see it in totality. So if your object is ever looking a bit weird, this could be something to check. Make sure your alpha is set to 1, unless you want it to be transparent. Again, we can control this with a texture. As you can see, it's a grayscale socket. So I'm going to left click this arrow on my color ramp and choose reset color ramp. I'll then set it to constant, and if I plug my color into the surface, I'm just going to drag my white slider so I've got a nice contrast between black and white values, so we can clearly see what's going to happen. Now, if you remember, black represents number 0 in grayscale values, and white represents number 1. So we need to have a think about which areas are going to be transparent and which areas are going to be opaque, which just means you can see it. Bonus points if you go ahead in Blender and try this yourself first before I demonstrate it. So go ahead and pause the video and give it a shot if you want to challenge yourself. Now I'm going to go ahead and plug this into the alpha, and then I'm going to plug my BSDF into the surface. Now you can see the areas that were black are now transparent and we can see through them, whereas the areas that were white are now opaque, which just means we can see them. I'll unplug this just now. Next we have normal. This allows us to edit the normal or face information of our object at a pixel level. One way we can do this is using a bump node, but we can also use normal maps in order to achieve similar effects. Essentially what this normal parameter will do is allow us to create some detail without having to do any additional modeling or sculpting. I'll press Shift A, and then under vector I'm going to choose bump. Then I'm going to plug the color of my color ramp here into the height, and then before I plug my normal into the normal, I want you to think about which areas are going to stick out and which areas are going to be indented. Remember, the black areas represent 0 and the white areas represent 1. I'll plug the normal into the normal, and there, now you can see the white areas of our texture are sticking out like this, and the black areas are appearing as indentations. And this isn't any 3D model detail, this is more like the simulation of detail using this normal input. If you're not sure what normals are, I do have a couple of videos on the channel explaining it. I'll leave a video to one of my most recent ones in the description below. I'll unplug this for now. For now, that about concludes the easy part of this tutorial. Now we're going to be going over the more advanced sections of this incredible shader. Why do I call this shader incredible? Well, I think it's hands down the best shader because of its sheer amount of versatility. As you can see, the settings we covered so far are already amazing enough, but we have all these additional settings which we can use, and it's all built into this single shader. So first of all, let's cover Subsurface. I'll left click this arrow to open up. Subsurface allows us to simulate something called subsurface scattering. Common materials that would use this would include skin, wax, and even materials like marble, which I believe is one of the only stones which actually uses subsurface scattering. Subsurface scattering is that effect you see when light glows through your fingers, for example, and creates that red effect. At the top here, you'll see something called random walk. This allows us to switch between different subsurface methods. The first one we'll see at the top here is Christensen-Burley. It isn't as accurate as the default, which is random walk. However, random walk is a Cycles only feature. Cycles, as you know, is a render engine, and what this pretty much means is if you're using the real-time Eevee engine, you'll have to stick with Christensen-Burley. According to the Blender wiki, sometimes this Christensen-Burley method will resolve noise faster. as you will find when you're using subsurface scattering, it is quite a noisy effect. Then we have random walk. This is considered a more accurate option for subsurface scattering, but of course you have to remember it is a cycles only feature. It also sometimes has some issues with overlapping faces and holes. So if you ever have issues when using this, that would probably be the first thing I would check. There's also this option called random walk skin, which is like the random walk but more optimized for skin, hence the name. Since I'm going to be covering something cycles only, we'll actually need to go into the render preview. So right now, if I left click this button here to go into render preview, we won't really see anything happening, and that's because we don't have any lighting in our scene. We're also currently in Eevee, only the Christensen-Burley method will work. So I'm going to change my render engine to cycles. Now I've done that, let's go ahead and set up an environment texture, or an HDRI. So I'm going to left click my world properties here, and under color, I'm going to left click the yellow dot and choose environment texture. But if I press open, I don't actually have any HDRIs on my computer to add. So we'll need to go to a free website first to get some. One site I like to use is this free resource called polyhaven.com. I'm not sponsored by them or anything, it's just a resource I like to use for a lot of my projects. You can see that they have a list of different things like HDRIs, textures and models. I mainly just use the textures and HDRIs as I find they're really good. If I go to browse HDRIs, you can see we've got a wide range of different images of different environments. And we can use these environments in Blender to light up our scenes realistically without much effort. That's not to say that point lights and things like that are useless, as I mainly use them for proper renders. However, these are perfect, especially for previewing materials and for some cases when doing outdoor environments. But personally, I mainly just use this to show off materials inside of tutorials and things of that nature. So let's go ahead and choose one. You can also come to the top here and you can filter. So I'm going to choose indoor to filter by the indoor ones. This one here is probably one of my favorites. So I'm going to left click it, and before I go ahead and press download, I can choose whether or not I want to download an EXR or an HDR file format. Both of these work fine inside of Blender. Usually though, nowadays I tend to use the EXR, as it's the default that Polyhaven seems to choose for me. You can just go ahead and press download, and once it's done, it'll show up in your downloads folder in your computer. I've already downloaded it, so I'm just going to leave it just now. Back in Blender, now I've downloaded that file, I can just go ahead and press open. And now if I come to my downloads folder here, in my Blender file browser, I can then come up to the top with the search bar and I can filter things by just searching EXR. If you downloaded the HDR format, you can search HDR instead. Then you can also change the type to see which type of EXR you're importing by just left clicking this button here, and that will take it to a thumbnail view so you can actually see what you're adding. And here you can find the photo studio which I want to add to my scene. So I'm just going to left click it and then press open image. Straight away you can see this has added some great realistic lighting to our scene. Perfect for previewing materials. I'm also going to come to the top here and turn off this button called show overlays. This will make my viewport a little bit clearer. Now let's go ahead and talk about this subsurface scattering. First of all, we have weight. A bit like with metallic, this is like an on and off switch, but instead of for metal or non-metal, this is for having subsurface scattering or not. So if I set this to 1, that's going to pretty much enable subsurface scattering. Right now you can see that our ball has gotten a lot more noisy, as I mentioned, subsurface scattering can create quite a lot of noise. So do be careful when using this if you want to keep your render times low. Also, another thing that will influence is the size of our object here. If I press N to open up the side menu here and come to my item options, under transform, you can see we have something called dimensions. Right now, this sphere is 2 meters by 2 meters by 2 meters. And here, in this parameter called scale, which is more like distance, you can see that the depth of our subsurface scattering, if you like, is only going in by 5 centimeters, which is 0.05 meters. But if I was to type in something like 50 centimeters, which is 0.5 meters, we'll be able to see our subsurface scattering effect a little bit more now, because it's a little bit of a bigger scale relative to our object. So you can think of this scale as more like an absolute distance rather than a scale parameter. A lot of the effect though happens in this radius parameter, and this is controlled by an X, Y and Z parameter, and X, Y and Z represent red, green and blue respectively. So the top channel here is controlling the red value, and you can see this is set to 1, which means red is going to be showing through the most. You'll notice this especially if I set my base color to maybe a more peachy color. We can notice how it's going to look a little bit more skin-like. I'm also going to set my roughness to something maybe like 0.2. You'll also notice that the green is set to 0.2 here, and the blue channel is set to 0.1 here. This is because it's pretty much the default for skin, as we have quite a red surface underneath our skin. But if I was to change this red value to 0.1 and then turn this blue value to 1, a blue undertone to our sphere here. If I set my scale here, or distance, to 5 meters, which is something quite high, you'll see that we can really see this blue effect now. We also have this parameter called anisotropy, which is another cycles only subsurface scattering feature. and it controls the direction of the volume scattering. It seems to be that some materials will have a specific preferred value for this parameter. For example, the Blender wiki here says that skin has been measured to have an anisotropy of 0.8. So I'm not sure if there's any resources online to get a specific anisotropy value, but that could be something worth researching into if you want to take your realism up a notch perhaps. However, this subsurface anisotropy value isn't something I have a lot of experience with. For now, I'm going to turn the weight on my subsurface down to 0. I'm going to move on to specular. I'm also going to turn my roughness down to 0, and I'm going to give my base color a nice blue color for the meantime. Although this turned out kind of violet, but I quite like that color. I'll close up this subsurface tab, and I'll open up specular. The first thing you're going to be greeted with here is this multi-scar GGX. This allows you to change between two different options. To be honest though, for most people, you don't really need to worry about that, so I'm not going to talk about it too much. Then we've got this thing called IOR level, and this allows us to control the presence of specular in the first place. You'll notice if I change this to 0, all we'll be able to see is the diffusion of the material with no reflections, which as you might guess is pretty unrealistic, as we should really be using the roughness parameter to control the clarity of our reflections rather than just turning them off completely. This is a beginner mistake that people used to do a lot of the time. When this used to just be the specular parameter, they would turn this to 0 in order to make a more rough material. But no, you want to always control your clarity of reflections using roughness. So for that reason, I'm going to leave my IOR level at 0.5. I believe there are ways to calculate an exact IOR level or specular level. However, if you don't really know how to do that yourself, I recommend just leaving this alone. And to be honest, we're probably looking at a fraction of a difference in appearance. So 99% of users are probably best just to leave this IOR level at 0.5 unless they want to achieve some kind of artistic effect. Just keep in mind, by changing this level too much without knowing what you're doing, you're guaranteed to give yourself an unrealistic result. The tint here will allow us to give us a little bit more artistic control over the specular. For example, if I change this to something like red, you can see that our specular reflection here has gone red like this. So this can be a pretty cool bit of extra artistic control. I'm going to left click it and I'm going to turn my saturation down to 0 to put it back to the default white color. Next up, we have anisotropic, and if I go ahead and set this to 1, we're going to notice no immediate difference. And that's because we actually need a bit of roughness in order for this effect to work. I'm going to go ahead and maybe set this to a roughness of, let's say, 0.5. And now you can see kind of what the anisotropic is doing. It's creating this kind of ring around here. We can also control where this ring is using this anisotropic rotation. For example, if I set this anisotropic rotation value to 0.2, you can see our anisotropic has rotated like this. You will probably use this anisotropic effect a lot with metallic materials. So I'm going to set my metallic value here to 1 just to showcase it. One example of using anisotropic would be maybe for a CD for example. So I'm going to come into my viewport shading here, just the default solid view, and I'm going to press Shift A, then under mesh I'm just going to choose cylinder, and I'm going to press S and Z and just scale it down so it's a really thin disc. Then I'll press G and then X to move it along, and I'll press R and then X to rotate it along the X axis. Then I'm going to right click and choose Shade Alt Smooth. I'm going to go ahead and apply our material to this as well, and I'll come back into render view. You can see that now our anisotropic effect is having this cool kind of CD effect on our disc here. So this is a common type of surface that you would probably use this anisotropic effect on. And you probably wouldn't be using this violet color with it, probably be more used with just a plain white color. For now I'm going to left click my cylinder and press X and delete it. I'm going to go ahead and turn my anisotropic and anisotropic rotation back down to 0. To do that I can just left click and then drag down, and that's going to allow me to edit both of these at the same time, and I'll just type in the number 0 and press enter. I'm also going to turn my metallic value back down to 0 for this next section. I'll close my specular tab and open up the transmission tab. Here we just have one parameter, and all we need to do is turn this weight to 1, and this is going to give us a glass material. Right now though, our glass is a little bit cloudy, and to fix that I can just turn my roughness to something low, like 0. Now you can see we have a nice stained glass material. Again, for materials using this transmission parameter, using this IOR can be great to add some extra realism. For example, you might want to change this value to the IOR for water if you're making a water material, and so on. There also used to be a parameter called transmission roughness, which would create a cloudy material inside, but unfortunately they have removed that awesome feature. For now, I'm just going to left click my weight and turn it down to 0. I'll close this up, and then I'm going to open up coat. Coat allows us to add something called a clear coat on top of our object. Clear coats are something used a lot in the car painting pipeline. Cars will typically be added a nice coloured paint, and then they will add a clear coat on top in order to protect it from the elements. But this clear coat can change the material. For example, we had a blue paint which was quite rough, maybe at like a roughness of 0.5. If this was a car material, maybe they would go ahead and add a clear coat on top. A lot of these paint layers can also be metallic sometimes, so I'm going to go ahead and set my metallic to 1 as well. So now we have the base layer of our car paint. In the manufacturing process, they would then go ahead and add a clear coat on top to give it a smoother finish and also to give it some protection against the elements. So I'll change my coat weight to 1 to turn it on. You can see now that it's almost like a glass material has been applied on top of our metallic material. This makes sense as we're literally layering an extra see-through material on top. So that is essentially what the clear coat does. It also has a roughness parameter, which allows us to adjust the reflection clarity of this clear coat itself. And then we have an IOR value, which allows us to adjust the index of refraction for the clear coat material. These IOR and roughness values won't affect the roughness or IOR of our layers underneath. We also have a tint. Contrary to what you might think, this tint won't actually affect the color of the clear coat, but it will affect everything underneath it. For example, if I give this tint a red color, you can see it's now going to add a purpley effect to everything underneath the clear coat. But the clear coat itself will still stay white. I'm going to go ahead and reset this tint by right clicking it and then choosing reset to default value. We also have our normal value, which if I plug my bump into this, will allow us to edit the normals just like with this parameter here, but this time it's just for our clear coat layer. I'll unplug this just now, and I'm going to go ahead and turn my weight of my clear coat to 0, which has effectively turned it off. For the next part, I'm going to go ahead and change my metallic down to 0. Next up, we have Sheen. Sheen is something we use to simulate loads of small hairs on a surface. To turn it on, we can go ahead and set it to 1. And straight away, you can see it's had this effect. I usually control the sheen not with the weight parameter, but with the roughness parameter instead. If I set this roughness to 0, you will notice very little effect. But as I increase my roughness, usually to around 0.3 is when you start to notice things, you can see we're starting to have this extra effect. And this is to simulate loads of small hairs. This is great for using on materials which are cloth in nature. Although I have heard of some artists who have used it to create a dust effect, and I plan on experimenting with that myself, and if I like the results, I'll go ahead and share it with you guys. The sheen tint is also really good to adjust the overall appearance. So I can left click this and maybe give it a pinky color, and you can see that that sheen effect is now got a pink overlay. So this is something you can definitely use a lot with your cloth materials, especially if you're doing a cloth simulation or something like that. I'm going to go ahead and right click this and reset it to default value. And I'm also going to reset the value of my sheen weight as well by right clicking it and choosing reset to default value. Next up, we have emission. By default it's set to 0, which means it's going to have no effect. But if I set this to 1, you can see that our object has now gone completely white, and it's actually turned our object into a light source. So you can increase the strength parameter to make our light source brighter. For example, 5. Color will control the color of this. Color will control the color of this emission, and of course you can use the color of textures in order to influence the color of our emission. I covered this a little bit more in depth in my emission shader node tutorial, as this is pretty much just the same. It's just like having the emission shader node built into our Principled BSDF, as it's a very versatile shader and it pretty much has most of what you need. Definitely check out that video for more tips on using emission, as everything I teach there will work in the Principled BSDF as well. I'll unplug the color for now, and I'm going to set my strength here to 0. Finally, we're going to go over the Principled BSDF's newest feature called Thin Film. Thin film is essentially an additional layer we can add to create an iridescent effect. This kind of effect is known as thin film interference, hence the name thin film. It also tends to appear stronger on top of darker surfaces. To demonstrate this, let's first of all turn on the thin film. So right now the thickness is set to 0, meaning there's no thin film at all because it's 0 or nothing. But I can go ahead and set this to something like 500 nanometers. And although it's subtle, you will notice a slight rainbow effect on top. And if I go ahead and change my base color to something like black, you'll notice since the material is darker, we can see this iridescent effect a lot more. Notice how if I turn my thin film thickness back down to 0, that iridescent effect has now disappeared. A common way to use this is to make bubbles. I'll be making a bit more of an in-depth tutorial on making bubbles soon, but for the meantime I'm just going to show you quickly how I would do it. First of all, I need to change my base color to white, so to do that I can just change my saturation down to 0, and I can put my value up to 1 to make it completely white. Then, as you might imagine, we're going to want to turn on transmission. So I'll open up the transmission tab and change the weight here to 1. Right now we have a really cloudy glass material, so to fix that I'm going to go ahead and change my roughness value to 0 to make our glass see-through. That's looking a lot better. Now let's go ahead and add our thin film. So I'll change my thickness here to something like 500 nanometers. Why it's measured in nanometers is because the thin film is a really thin surface, and that's what actually allows us to create this thin film effect in the first place, as it's so thin that it creates that rainbow effect. Even the most thinnest surfaces you can think of, such as hairs, are usually nowhere near as thin as like a bubble, for example, or these kind of oily layers that create this rainbow effect. So I'll set it to 500 and left click to confirm it, and straight away you can see we've got this iridescent effect on top, but it kind of more looks like there's a thin film on top of a glass material, and that's not quite what we're wanting. Rather, we don't want to just be layering on thin film, Instead, we want to be creating a thin film on top of air, which would essentially create a bubble. So to do that, the IOR for air is actually 1. So if we change our IOR here, we will change it from a glass material to kind of like an air material. And then we'll have our thin film on top of that. So I'll change my IOR up at the top here to 1. Make sure it's not the IOR here, as this is the IOR of the thin film, and we're only wanting to change the IOR of the glass material underneath. So once I've set it to 1, I'll just press enter to save it. And now you can see we have a proper bubble. Since this material is see-through, if you view it from an angle with a darker background, for example, I'll rotate to the left here, the iridescent effect will become more noticeable. In my bubble tutorial, I'll give you a little bit more tips for creating some more interesting looking bubbles using some texture. But for now, I think that's a really good introduction to the thin film on our Principled BSDF shader. Wow, that really was a lot of features, so well done for making it through this entire tutorial. This is definitely going to be one of the longer ones in this shader node in-depth series, so well done for making your way all the way through it. I'd also say it's probably the most valuable lesson in this series, so double props to you for following it all the way through. Make sure to stick around for the next video, as I've got a new course coming out on texture baking. So if you like materials and shader nodes and things like that, you're definitely going to enjoy this new course called Texture Baking Mastery, and I'll be uploading videos on it every day. So if that sounds exciting to you, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on that new free exciting content. Apart from that though, I'd like to thank you so much for watching this tutorial, and I hope you found it useful. Take care.